which is a series of essays that paints a dystopian picture of not just the future but the present. You state in movies like Mad Max Fury Road, they make the apocalypse cool and not as bleak as the original. There is something to be said about that original film that's also filmed in Australia. For those that haven't seen it, it's really dark because the world hasn't ended yet. And Australia is a great backdrop because it is so vast.
Mm.
Tell me about what you're thinking when you say that.
So I think I write a lot in the book about cyberpunk. One of the things that one of the reasons I think cyberpunk is such a key genre is because the best cyberpunk writers have brought their fiction closer and closer to the present moment, and that's to kind of, I think, acknowledge the fact that we live in a very dystopian present moment. So, there's a key quote attributed to William Gibson, which I use at the start of the book.
Mhm.
The future's already here; it's just not evenly distributed. And he actually kind of used that phrase a lot among his friends, so the story goes, and then was kind of quoted as saying it in a 2003 Economist article, and then it's since become kind of like a very well-worn William Gibson phrase to describe the dystopian present. So, he's making the argument there that, all of the things that exist in cyberpunk, whether that's technological acceleration, surveillance and control, wild inequality and impoverishment of people, all of those things already exist in the present. The future is already here. So cyberpunk is very much a literature concerned with the present. And I think the first Mad Max falls into that category
Mhm.
too. Particularly if you think about like the time and place when it was made. George Miller was coming out of the independent Australian film industry. There were quite a lot of like car movies being made in Australia at the time. I think there's a brilliant one called The Cars That Ate Paris, which is a classic of the genre.
Oh, I gotta check
Um,
it out. Thank you.
all of these like had a bit of a dystopian feel. If you've ever seen Death Race 2000,
Yes.
that had a similar vibe to some of these Australian car movies. So Mad Max was definitely in that tradition, and it was a kind of dystopian tradition. But what I think he nailed was just that sense of collapse, not so much on a societal level, but on a personal level. What you see in that film is that there is already a world that exists like beneath the strata of the real world, which has rules and policemen.
Mhm.
And it's already chaos, it's already violence, it's already resource war. It's just that people like Max are only starting to wake up to it, and they still live half in the old world. He's got a
Yes.
family, he's got a wife, he's got a kid, and he's violently dragged into the apocalypse. And there's a quote that I use later in the book from, I think it's Angelica Sakar from the Autolith group. She says, the moment that the apocalypse starts is different for everybody. So for someone living in the
Mm.
Amazon jungle, seeing their, ancestral homelands destroyed, like the apocalypse might have started when that began. For someone living in a fairly privileged Western culture, if we get to 2 degrees sea rise and the flood barriers fail and your house floods, that's when the apocalypse begins for you. So I think that's what Mad Max really dramatizes is kind of that moment for a person when the apocalypse begins, when you realize none of the old rules apply, when it becomes that dog eat dog scenario. And I think that makes it more powerful as a metaphor now because we're closer to collapse ourselves. And if you look at something like Fury Road, which came out more recently, it's still an allegory for the same thing, like a post-collapse world. And it still portrays a fairly realistic scenario, like a lawless Australia drawn into resource conflict. But you're kind of much more encouraged to identify with Max as a hero, as the person watching the film, you as the subject are playing the part of the hero, wandering the wasteland, looking for redemption. So these are stories of escape. These are stories of catharsis. Really, we get to experience a little soupçon of the apocalypse while safe in our cinema seats. That's quite different, I think, to the kind of creep and terror that lingers from a film like the original. It's not a comfortable dystopia.
Is the original the Road Warrior or is the original Mad Max? I always
Yeah,
forget.
that's the first one. Yeah.
The Road Warrior is the original? There's something about the original. There's a line in the original where he's talking to his captain, who, if you know the sequel, becomes one of the bad guys.
Mm.
But I think he's playing a totally different person, right? Because does Hollywood make the second and third, or no? They're still made in Australia.
I think it's made. I think the second one's still made in Australia, but is Hollywood money, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's a different feel. And what
Mm.
for me makes the first one so eerie is the fact that it takes place kind of in the present.
Mm.
And I believe it's taking place right after the gas crisis.
Yeah.
So the idea that fuel is so precious um, makes a lot more sense to me. And there's a scene where the night, what is the bad guy that dies in the beginning? 'Cause that's the whole movie, is there's a guy that dies trying to outrun the cops, and
That's right.
him and the cops.
Isn't he a cop himself? I think.
No, he's a bad guy. There's nondescript bad guys in Mad Max, which is awesome, but a kind of a road pirate. Um, him and the cop. That's why you thought the cop was the bad guy, because him and the cop are doing this vicious chase through the streets in Australia, and they're the outback for the most part, and they're just mowing down civilians,
Mm.
right? Because the cops kind of have these badass cars as well, just mowing them down. And they I guess it's on purpose. They kill the guy, and that's why the bad dudes come back and they look for the cops to kill him. It was revenge for their leader. But there's a scene where Mel Gibson's character quits the force because he goes, "I don't know the difference between me and them."
Mm.
And that scene kind of resonates with me because from where I'm from in the San Francisco Bay Area, and also the fact that they're mowing down civilians, like they care not about how they get the bad guy, if you
Mm.
will. And it's also, it tells one of these stories about it's not just crime, but the rot of the system.
Yeah.
And in these movies, the rot of the system is that we're not punishing people enough. That
Yeah.
goes away with the sequel. In the sequel, there's
It
cool
becomes
punk
more
rock hits.
fantastical. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so I think like that's what I'm trying to say about cyberpunk as well, is that like when it's purely aesthetic, it can be figuratively empty. That's not to say that like meaningful science fiction and cyberpunk can't look cool. It absolutely can. It's more to say that if it doesn't directly speak to the present, then it's very easy for it to become escapism. Somebody's corrected us in the chat there. A Road Warrior is indeed the second one. The first one
Okay.
I think is just Mad Max.
Yeah,
But
okay.
and in a way, Road Warrior is a little bit of a retread. I mean, this is the funny thing about the Mad Max films. It's not like it's a pre-franchise franchise. But I don't know if you've ever seen a 2014 film called The Rover. That's another Australian movie. Guy Pearce and Robert Pattinson. And in a way, for me, that feels like a spiritual sequel to the original Mad Max setup. It's set on dust back roads of a collapsed Australia. Guy Pearce plays a guy who's just trying to get from A to B, but has clearly lost everything.
Mhm.
And he gets tangled up with some cops, and there's a scene where it becomes apparent that the cops he's become tangled up with are kind of the worst gang in town. A little bit like what you were saying. So,
Mhm.
um, at that point, the cop kind of gives him like a little bit of an ultimatum, and he replies, whatever you think is over for me already happened. Like, you can't fuck with me because everything has already happened. Like I died a long time ago, effectively. That's an incredibly kind of powerful movie, because it's like the introspective Mad Max. It doesn't really have violence, car chases, but it inhabits that spiritual post-apocalypse of what it's like to live with grief, what it's like to grieve a world. So in that sense, I think it's got something to say about like collapse and climate collapse as well. So yeah, I think Australia's got a great tradition of these post-apocalypse movies, and they come in both flavors.
Yeah, and they have really good horror movies.
Yeah.